I was making coffee the other day, using my reusable filter as always, feeling good about myself, and it kind of hit me. Like, what about all those tiny plastic bits that still get through? It's like this invisible threat. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. Microplastics. These tiny particles finding their way into our bodies. We've got a stack of research on how these microplastics are showing up in human organs, even the brain, and what the potential health risks might be.
It's unsettling how much research has come out just in the past few years. We're finding microplastics everywhere we look, in places we never thought they'd reach. It really makes you wonder, what does this mean for our health in the long run?
Okay, so let's break this down. Microplastics. They're basically these minuscule pieces of plastic, way smaller than a human hair, right? But where do they even come from? And how are they getting inside us?
You got it. Think about it this way. Every time a plastic bottle breaks down, or you wash clothes made from synthetic fibers, those release tiny fragments.
Yeah.
Even things like microbeads in cosmetics used to be a huge contributor, though many are banned now. The problem is, these microplastics get into the environment, into our water, our food, even the air we breathe, and that's how they end up inside us.
So it's not like they just pass right through us. They're actually hanging out in our organs. The research mentions the liver, kidneys, lungs, even heart tissue. That's kind of freaky.
It is. And what's even more alarming is the discovery of microplastics in the brain. The National Institutes of Health, which is the primary agency in the U.S. responsible for biomedical and public health research, to the study, and they found the levels of microplastics in brain tissue were way higher than in other organs. We're talking potentially 10 to 20 times more. It seems like our brains are turning into microplastic hotspots, which raises some serious concerns about potential neurological effects.
Whoa, that's a lot to process. So why is the brain so susceptible? Shouldn't it have like a defense system?
Well, the brain does have the blood-brain barrier, which acts as a filter to keep harmful substances out. Think of it as a tightly controlled border crossing for your brain. But what's worrying is that this barrier, as effective as it is, doesn't seem to be as good at stopping these tiny plastic particles.
What are the researchers saying about the potential risks of having these microplastics in our bodies, especially in the brain? Should we be seriously worried right now?
That's the question everyone is asking. While research is still in its early stages, the findings from animal studies and some preliminary research in humans are definitely concerning. Some animal studies have shown microplastics leading to fertility issues, problems with learning and memory, and even certain cancers. While it's still early, we can't ignore these early warning signs.
And the research mentions a possible link to dementia, even Alzheimer's disease, right?
Exactly. Researchers found a correlation between higher microplastic levels in brain samples and dementia, including Alzheimer's. Of course, it's not a direct cause and effect situation, but it's definitely a red flag that needs further investigation. It makes you wonder if there's a connection between the increasing prevalence of these neurological conditions and the rise of plastic pollution.
It's all pretty disturbing. And it's not just the brain, right? There was something about microplastics being found in carotid arteries, too. For our listeners who may not know, those are the major arteries in the neck that supply blood to the brain. That sounds scary.
Absolutely. In fact, they found that individuals with microplastics in their carotid arteries had more than double the risk of having a heart attack, stroke, or even dying. This is really concerning because it suggests that microplastic accumulation could be contributing to cardiovascular disease, one of the leading causes of death worldwide.
This is a lot to take in, but I'm curious, is there anything we can do to lower our exposure to these microplastics right now?
Researchers are recommending some steps, like minimizing your use of plastic when preparing food, especially microwaving in plastic containers. And since microplastics can cling to dust, it's a good idea to stay on top of dusting, especially in areas where you eat.
The research we have also suggests cutting back on meat, particularly processed meats. Could help reduce our microplastic intake, right?
That's because microplastics can build up in animals, and we end up consuming them when we eat meat. So reducing meat consumption, especially animals higher up the food chain, could potentially lower our microplastic intake.
This is where things start to feel a little like a ticking time bomb. There's research indicating that the levels of microplastics in our bodies are actually increasing over time, aren't they?
You're right. One study looked at brain samples taken over an 8-year period and found that microplastic levels had shot up by a shocking 50%. That's basically mirroring the increase of microplastics we see in the environment as a whole. It paints a pretty grim picture as plastic pollution keeps getting worse. So too does our exposure and the potential for long-term health problems.
If this is such a growing threat, what's being done at a regulatory level? Are there any regulations about microplastics in our food and water?
Sadly, in the United States,
Yeah.
we don't currently have any government standards for microplastics in our food or water.
Seriously, that's really disheartening. But the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, is at least doing something, right?
They are taking some initial steps. The EPA is working on establishing guidelines for measuring microplastics and has been supporting research on better ways to detect and measure them. It's a good start, but we definitely need more action, especially in terms of setting safety standards.
And what about the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA? Do they acknowledge microplastics as a potential health risk?
Interestingly, their official statement kind of downplays the concern. They claim that based on the current scientific evidence, there's no proof that the microplastics or nanoplastics detected in our food actually pose a risk to human health.
But that seems kind of dismissive, considering all the research we've been discussing.
You're right. It's important to remember that the research on microplastics is still evolving, and it does take time to get conclusive proof. The FDA is likely being cautious, but their stance could certainly shift as more research comes out.
So are we stuck just waiting and hoping for the best while microplastics build up in our bodies?
Not necessarily. There's some positive news coming from the global stage. The United Nations Environment Assembly has started developing a global treaty to address plastic pollution head-on.
That's great news. What exactly will this treaty do?
It's aiming to reduce plastic production, improve waste management, and promote sustainable alternatives to plastic. It's a big step in the right direction and a hopeful sign that we're moving towards real solutions.
It definitely sounds like we need a multifaceted approach to tackle this. Individual actions to lower our exposure, more research to fully understand the risks, and global cooperation to address the core problem, which is plastic pollution itself.
Exactly, and one of the most powerful tools we have in this fight is awareness.
Absolutely. So what are some of the most surprising or impactful things that stand out to you? From all the research you've been doing on this topic, what should our listeners be most concerned about?
To be honest, what strikes me the most is how insidious this whole problem is. These microplastics, they're invisible to the naked eye, yet they've somehow managed to infiltrate practically every corner of our environment. And as we've been discussing, our own bodies. It's a stark reminder that even things we can't see can have a huge impact on our health.
It's like a real-life science fiction movie. Tiny invaders infiltrating our systems. But this is our reality now, so how do we deal with it? What can we do?
Knowledge is power. The more we understand about these microplastics, where they come from, how they get into our bodies, and the potential health risks, the better equipped we'll be to make informed choices and push for real change.
Speaking of informed choices, what can our listeners do in their everyday lives to minimize their exposure to microplastics? What are some practical steps we can all take?
There are actually quite a few things you can do to reduce your microplastic footprint. One simple change is choosing reusable water bottles and coffee cups instead of single-use plastic ones.
I'm definitely guilty of grabbing a disposable coffee cup on busy mornings. I need to get better about that.
We all have our habits to break. Another easy step is to use reusable shopping bags and avoid those flimsy plastic produce bags at the grocery store. And you know what else can make a difference? Filtering your tap water.
Really? Filtering our water can help reduce microplastics.
Absolutely. There are lots of water filters out there that can effectively trap those tiny particles.
Okay, I'm adding that to my to-do list. What about clothing? I've read that synthetic fabrics like polyester can release microplastics when washed.
That's right. Washing synthetic clothing releases microfibers, which are a type of microplastic. Try to wash those clothes less often. Use a gentle cycle. And consider laundry detergent specifically designed to minimize microfiber shedding. And whenever you need to buy new clothes, look for natural fibers like cotton, wool, or linen whenever possible.
Those are great tips. It's good to know that even small changes in our daily routine can actually make a difference. But I think we can all agree that individual action is only part of the solution. We need bigger, systemic change to really address the root of the plastic problem.
Couldn't agree more. We have to hold corporations accountable for their role in producing all this plastic and how they manage their waste. We need policies that incentivize the development and use of sustainable alternatives to plastic. And we need to support the organizations out there that are actively working to clean up our oceans and waterways.
It's a daunting task, but I'm hopeful if we all work together, we can make progress. What resources are out there for our listeners who want to learn more? or get involved in the fight against plastic pollution.
There are some amazing organizations doing really important work in this area. One group I always recommend is the Plastic Pollution Coalition. They have a ton of information and resources on their website and are very active on social media. Another great organization is the Ocean Conservancy. They organize beach cleanups and advocate for policy changes to reduce plastic waste. And for those interested in the scientific side of things, the Five Gyres Institute is a research organization conducting expeditions to study the impact of plastic in our oceans.
Those all sound like fantastic resources. We'll make sure to include links to those organizations in our show notes for everyone.
That's great. The more people we can get involved in this issue, the better. It's going to take all of us working together to turn the tide on plastic pollution.
So as we start wrapping up our deep dive into microplastics, let's recap the key takeaways for our listeners. We've learned that these tiny particles are practically everywhere, getting into our bodies through the food we eat, the water we drink, and even the air we breathe.
And what's even more concerning is that microplastics aren't just passing through our systems. They're accumulating in our organs, including our brains. There's a growing body of evidence linking microplastic exposure to various health issues, from fertility problems and cognitive decline to cardiovascular disease and even cancer.
While there's still much we don't know about the long-term impacts of microplastic accumulation, the research we do have is certainly a wake-up call.
Absolutely. It's a call to action for all of us to rethink our relationship with plastic and make changes to reduce our exposure and protect our health. This isn't just about us. It's about the health of our planet and future generations.
What's the final thought you want to leave our listeners with today? It really feels like we're at a turning point with this issue. It's encouraging to see so many people and organizations stepping up to address the problem of plastic pollution and its impact on our health.
I agree. The growing awareness is definitely a crucial first step towards finding real solutions.
So if we're finding microplastics in our bodies now, and the levels are actually increasing over time, what does that mean for the future? Is it just going to keep getting worse?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
If we continue on the same path, with plastic production and consumption continuing to rise, the situation is likely to worsen. But I remain optimistic. There's a growing movement to address this problem, with individuals making more conscious choices, businesses developing sustainable alternatives, and governments implementing policies to reduce plastic waste. We have the power to change course.
That's a really important point. It can feel overwhelming sometimes, like one person can't make a difference. But all those individual actions, combined with larger systemic changes, can add up to real progress.
Absolutely. Every step we take to reduce our reliance on plastic, whether it's using a reusable water bottle or supporting policies that promote sustainable materials, is a step in the right direction. It sends a message to businesses and policymakers that we demand change.
It's like a ripple effect. Each choice we make can have a wider impact. So before we go, what's the one thing you'd like our listeners to take away from this deep dive into the world of microplastics?
I think the most important takeaway is this. While the presence of microplastics in our bodies is a serious concern, it's not a reason to despair. We have the knowledge and the tools to address this challenge. We need to keep learning, keep making conscious choices, and keep advocating for a healthier, more sustainable future. The choices we make today will determine the world we live in tomorrow.
That's a powerful message to end on. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today and helping us all better understand this complex and crucial issue.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has empowered you with knowledge and inspired you to take action. Remember, even small changes can make a big difference. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.